Good afternoon, everybody. This is the May 6, 2022 House Bill 737 Study Commission for Polyfluorinated Alkylated Substances Environmental Subcommittee. And I guess we'll just make introductions. I'm Chris Bandazian. I am chairing the subcommittee. And Mike, do you want to, and Joe, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Mike Wimsatt. I serve as director of the Waste Division, and I am the commissioner's designee to this commission and subcommittee.
Okay. Hi, Joe Ayotte. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey and serve as a subject matter expert for folks.
Okay, and this is a publicly available meeting. At the end, if there are members of the public who wish to submit comments or ask questions, we will address those at that time. And we do not have subcommittee meeting minutes or notes to approve. And so I'd just like to move on to an update by Mike. I know we have a meeting next week, and this has been a very long week for your team. I'm sure Wednesday night was a long session getting ready for it. Must have been a long process, and probably fielding questions yesterday was as well. So, we don't have to do too deep a dive on these items, but one is just an update on where things stand with the soil study.
Sure. So I prepared some talking points for everything on your agenda for DES.
Okay, then let me just send it over to you.
And I have something to report as far as the USGS study goes, but since we have a representative of USGS, I didn't know if Joe, I don't want to presume to talk for his group. So I don't know, Joe, do you want to speak to that, or are you okay with me giving a brief update on what?
Completely happy with you giving that update. And if there are questions, I can fill in.
Great. So my understanding right now is that, as we've discussed before, there's essentially three parts to this study. There's initial phase one was a statewide review of soil quality, about 100 samples taken. And that part of it basically is getting very close. There's a data report that's getting very close, as I understand it, to being ready for release, and it will go up on USGS's website when that is ready. So I don't have a date for you, but I think that's within, I don't know, a couple of weeks, Joe. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right.
Okay. And then the second phase of the work was laboratory work using soil samples that were obtained in the field, but to do some laboratory studies. My understanding is that much of that work in the lab has been done, that a lot of samples from the columns that are being used in the study have been taken, and that we're awaiting analysis of and the data reports to come back on the analysis of those samples. And then phase three was really some site-specific field work, or site-specific work, looking at, as it turns out, two key sites. One is the Brentwood Fire Training Site, where we know that there were significant releases of firefighting foam and contamination in the soil and groundwater. And the other one is at the White Farm, which is state-owned property here in Concord, where biosolids potentially containing PFAS have been applied for a number of years. The field work for that, meaning the soil samples and groundwater samples that are taken as part of the study, has been completed. And again, we're in that phase. Whoop, and Joe's got something to add to that. Oh no, that's an okay. And my understanding is we're waiting for the data to come back, and so in the coming weeks and months we should be getting that data in and able to talk about what it really means. So that's, and the only other piece I'll note is that in the first phase of the project, where we took soil samples across the state, there are about 15 sites. And keep in mind, we identified these sampling locations with an eye towards us not necessarily being aware of any other potential localized sources of PFAS, that we're really trying to look at, I hate to use the term, but in a way, background from global deposition of PFAS that we're aware of. But we did get some data from about 15 of the 100 sampling locations where we're a little bit uncertain it's a little higher than what we're seeing everywhere else, and we're trying to make sure that those are really valid samples. So we're going out, we've identified a list of about 15 sampling locations where we're going to go back and get another sample and then have that reanalyzed. So it'll be probably a couple months before we get that underway and get that data back, but we just want to be a little bit careful before we make too many conclusions based on that data. So that's what I understand where we're at on the USGS. And then if there are no questions on that, the next issue on the agenda was resampling of private wells. And Golder, Saint-Gobain's consultant, continues to do resampling for wells that come in between 10 and 12 parts per trillion, so just below the 12 part per trillion standard. They have not yet expanded that work. Our recent request, which I'll talk about in a minute, a letter that was recently sent out requesting a groundwater management permit application, is kind of going to put that issue front and center, because monitoring of existing untreated drinking water wells is really a key component of any groundwater management permit that we administer. And the scope of that, really, it has to be said, is going to be unprecedented. All of our other sites are much smaller in scope and size. And so we anticipate some difficulty in reaching an agreement on the scope and extent of that monitoring plan. So by way of managing expectations, I want people to understand that we're going to be getting an application for a permit that is unlike any other we've had before, and it's going to take us some time to iron all that out. But it's certainly the case that anytime you've got a site where there are wells that are not above the standard, that are not undergoing treatment or provision of alternate water, you're going to have a fairly robust monitoring program to keep an eye on those wells to make sure that conditions aren't changing. So that's going to be a part of that. And then the next item on the agenda was the Northeast Conference. And of course, that's the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, or NWMOA, as we call it, hosted really a terrific conference back earlier in early April, attended by something on the order of 600 people in Marlborough, Massachusetts. I think I almost want to say over 100 sessions. They ran concurrent sessions throughout the conference for 2 days, and they were concurrent so that it was one of those deals where you wanted to see every single presentation, but you could only do one at a time. But the good news is, and I know that there's been a lot of interest on the people on the commission about seeing those slides, and it took a little bit of time to get those up. But my understanding, I've gone to the website. They are up on NWMOA's website, and I'll be happy to share the link. It's one of those things where it's sort of intuitive, but you have to understand how to get to the presentation. So I'll just say it here, and then when I provide the link, I'll provide it in writing as well. But what you need to do is you go to the NWMOA.org website. That's the easy part. And then under the What's New, you click on the Northeast, the Science of PFAS Conference. And then when you click on that, you'll get an agenda page, or I should say an overall page. And one of the items to select is agenda. And if you click on agenda, you'll then get a rolling agenda. And then you look through it, and it's of course ordered like an agenda is, the dates and times that things occurred. If you click on the session title, that will get you to a detailed page of the session, which usually had anywhere from 2 to 3 separate presentations. And at the bottom of that description, there would be a name or a reference to the PowerPoint presentation for a given presentation, and then you click on that, and then you can view the slides. So it's not a 2-click thing. It takes about 4 clicks or 5 clicks to get there, but and not every
somewhat intuitive anyway.
Not every single presentation is on there, but most of them are. So it's a really robust collection of presentations, and they were terrific. I mean, we had scientists, engineers, consulting firms, regulators from all over the country, really, who presented, and it was a terrific conference. And then, last of all, the update on the site itself. So I think the most significant developments for us are that we've had 2 letters within the last month that really, I think, are sort of some milestone communications that we've had with the company. The first one is on April 28th. We sent a letter commenting on their supplemental site investigation, which we've had in-house here for a number of months, and at our regular meetings, I said we're still under review, and while I'm happy to say it's no longer under review, we commented on it. And that letter, in addition to a number of things, did a couple of important things. It, as I mentioned before, it requested submittal of a groundwater management permit application within 120 days. And again, a groundwater management permit, it's called a permit. It sounds like it's a permit to do something. And really what it is it's a permit that sets out requirements that you need to comply with. And what it does is it requires them to establish a groundwater management zone, which ostensibly will likely be the entire consent decree area, and within which, you know, the groundwater is contaminated. And then set out a network of monitoring wells for regular monitoring, and we issue a permit usually for a 5-year period, renewable after 5 years. So this site will undoubtedly have a groundwater management permit that runs for many, many years, but the first permit will have a 5-year duration. And then it will set out, you know, monitoring wells that need to be sampled, which will include undoubtedly wells that are actually on the site itself, but will also include a number of wells scattered throughout the groundwater management zone, which of course we know is very big. It's like 64 square miles. And then also and this is where I think it's going to be somewhat difficult, identifying the frequency at which wells that are private drinking water wells located within the zone that are not being subjected to treatment, but that are still being used and that currently meet the standards, how often those will need to be monitored and tested to make sure that the conditions that we see right now are either remaining or if it's changing in some fashion. And then that letter requested submittal of a remedial action plan. And that is required to be submitted. Again, the groundwater management plan is due in 120, that application is due in 120 days from the date of our April 28th letter. But the remedial action plan was requested to be submitted within 120 days of receipt of the stormwater and surface water data that they are to collect this spring. My understanding is that has not been collected yet. So that's a little bit less certain. The 120-day clock for submittal of the remedial action plan will start when they actually get that data back. So that's probably at least a couple months out before that data is collected and then received. And then the second letter was one that was issued on May 4th, so just this past Wednesday. And that was in response to a submittal of a addendum 14 for, you may remember the sampling plan for sampling drinking water wells came in a series of addenda to the plan. The most recent one they submitted was the addendum 14. And so we approved that for implementation, but we also requested that we noted in the letter that there are a couple hundred wells that are within the area. They're not disputing that they could sample in those areas necessarily, but they aren't necessarily within 500 feet of a previously detected exceedance. So Saint-Gobain was essentially saying they weren't planning to sample any wells that weren't within 500 feet. Our letter articulates that the department's position is that really any wells within the consent decree area we believe are at potential risk of being contaminated by PFAS emissions from the company. So as a result, we think really any wells should be on the table. And given the number of wells that have been sampled and the number remaining in that category is relatively small by comparison, we've asked them to include those remaining wells in the next addendum that they submit for consideration. And we've also, you remember, there's also this category of wells that are or properties that are located within a fixed buffered distance of other potential sources of PFAS other than the plant site. And their position has been that that the agency should be asking those other potential sources to do this sampling first. And we have a disagreement with them on that. We think that given the location, given the other data in the consent decree area, that the properties in these buffered areas are really just as potentially impacted as any others. And so we've asked them to include those properties, which number I think between about 200 and 300 in this next addendum. So what we'd like to see, and we've asked that this be submitted by June 3rd, we'd like to see an addendum that includes several hundred properties that would essentially round out this study inside the consent decree area. And so that, you know, we will have looked at all the wells that need to be looked at. So that's what we're hoping to get on June 3rd. That's what the letter requested. And I think that probably completes the description and my remarks for the agenda.
Mike, this may be a question more for Jeff. So if you don't know, you don't know. But
Sure.
You know, some individuals have had wells privately tested. They haven't wanted to wait, so they've gotten them privately tested and have had positive results. And, you know, and I can ask the one person that I know because I don't see it was sampled April of 2021, came back in excess of the MCL. It's not on the state map. And so I don't know what the mechanism is for reporting with the labs that privately test.
Sure. No, we always ask that if people do get their wells tested privately, that they share their data with us. So, and do you happen to know, is this a well that's located, I'm assuming this is a property that's located outside the consent decree area?
No, it's within.
Oh, okay. Then yeah, I would say that probably the best thing to do would be for that person to contact Jeff directly.
I'll reach out to them because I had that conversation, and then a year ago we had a public session, and I said it was within days of that, and I said, wait, don't contact Jeff until you hear at the meeting
Okay.
what they may want you to do. So I will follow up on that. And then they went and got their own system, privately paid for it. And you know, I know that was part of the discussion last Wednesday, how people within the consent decree who have paid for private systems would get compensated.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure we haven't really sorted that out yet, but yeah, by all means, if there's data there to be had that we don't possess yet, I would encourage that person to reach out to Jeff and share that data if they're so inclined.
All right. So I guess I haven't looked at the NMOA stuff. I don't know if they've covered agriculture at all, but I wanted to at least get a start, you know, on risk assessment for agricultural products. And I don't know, Mike, if there's any interagency communication about that. You know, Dr. Patali gave us some update. I know it's very much a work in progress here.
Yeah, that's an area that I think really nationally we're a little behind on, right? A lot of states, including New Hampshire, have worked really hard to get their arms around the drinking water problem and the scope and magnitude of that. The data that's available for really providing good advice or guidance regarding raising, you know, a home garden and that kind of thing is really not really where it needs to be, and we're doing what we can to try to augment that. We've been doing, and you know, in the whole food area, right? We've got some work going on, some collaborative work with Dartmouth and others looking at shellfish and seafood, and we're contemplating some studies on garden vegetables. But right now we just don't have, and unfortunately that's been true for a number of years now, right? I mean, I'm sure that there is a lot of work going on. A lot of times you don't hear about the work until someone gets to the point where they're ready to publish a paper. But I can't imagine that there isn't a lot of that work going on. But until the studies are published, it's often very difficult to know about that work or certainly to get any definitive data from it. You know, the general advice we provided from early on is if you have the ability to, you know, if you got a home garden and you're in the area, if you have the ability to ensure that you're using PFAS-free water to irrigate it, that's a good thing. We don't necessarily have a reason to believe that, you know, concentrations in the soils themselves are necessarily contributing significantly to to what might be in edible crops that are raised, but we just don't have a lot of information about it. So, but the general advice is, you know, particularly for things that are very high in water content, like leafy greens and things like that, if you're going to raise those things for your own consumption, you know, try to use PFAS-free water for irrigation. And you know, that's not a very satisfying, you know, body of knowledge to convey, but that's what we've got right now. We just don't have a lot of information about that.
So, I mean, I don't know. Do you know if anyone in the Department of Agriculture is looking at an advisory or?
You know, I think they are certainly aware of this issue. I don't believe they're doing any of their own sort of research or anything into it. So anything that they could provide would probably be based on their review of existing literature, which admittedly is not as complete as it needs to be. I don't want to speak for them, but I'm not aware of them being really, you know, significantly engaged on this topic.
You know, I think there are probably two ends of the spectrum where maybe some advice can be given as an advisory, and I'm just speculating and need to look a little bit further. One is, you know, if there's some clear soil contamination, you know, you would not want to go to a place where there was a ground release and plant lettuce on the St. Gobain's, and you could say
I think that absolutely, that would go without saying, absolutely.
And you know, somewhere in between. I mean, the products that people apply are not labeled for PFAS, unfortunately, and you know that including biosolids can contaminate or may be perfectly benign. You know, but the other end of this spectrum is people who are being cautious and avoiding growing things when there might be precautions, just like there is with lead contaminated soil. People, you know, bring in potting soil and grow in containers or grow in raised beds, and it may be, you know, in the broad spectrum, healthier to grow your own vegetables under careful conditions than to avoid it altogether.
Right.
And so it seems to me
like, issues
you know,
of
we may be able
to,
whether it's the county extension service or somebody ought to be able to give guidance to the people in New Hampshire at least those two extremes. You know, when worry is warranted, when worry is not warranted.
I think we will get to a point where we have a lot better body of knowledge from which to, you know, formulate that kind of guidance. I'm not sure it's really there yet. You know, I mean, part of the problem with PFAS is it's still pretty integrated into our into commerce, and you know, early on, and I don't know how this has developed nationally, but you know, early on, there was some indication that soil conditioners placed in potting soil might even have PFAS added purposely because of the nature of how it behaves. And so, you know, bringing in potting soil may or may not be a good idea. These are all, and I wish I had really definitive answers for that, but I don't. I mean, you know, for years you've been able to buy mill organite, right? Which a lot of people always wonder, what is that? Must be some kind of natural product. It's, you know, it's processed wastewater treatment sludge from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So, you know, it's not ivory snow, right? And so there's that whole issue of not really knowing from where various purchased agricultural products come from and what they've been blended with.
So those are really the two things. I think I would like to take some time with the NUMOA site rather than speculate on things, but those were the areas I really wanted to cover in this meeting. I think the legislative session is winding down. I'd like to hear a post-mortem next week on some things that didn't get anywhere. Surface water is one of them. That's a bit of a mystery to me why that was didn't get farther this time around.
Yeah, and I wasn't able to run it to ground before this meeting because I needed to get with Ken Edwardson of our staff, who's been closest to this. But I do know that EPA issued some guidance on surface water within the last few weeks. And what I don't know, and so what I wanted to talk to Ken about, is what that means in the coming weeks and months in terms of what we expect EPA to do with that and what impact that has on our surface water regulatory program. So I will try to learn that before the full commission meeting next Friday and try to have something to say about that. But I wasn't able to get it for this meeting.
Mhm. And I did see something about regulating it through the stormwater permit, as well, the existing stormwater permits.
Yeah, and if you, I'll be sharing links with those letters that I referenced at next week's meeting. And that one of the topics of comment in one of the letters, the letter that commented on the supplemental site investigation, included a discussion of the fact that acknowledging that we don't have surface water standards, but encouraging Saint-Gobain to include the surface water pathway as part of its remedial action planning. And they know that that's going to be important because, you know, it would be short-sighted not to do that, because we are definitely headed to a place where we're going to be looking at some level of regulation of these compounds in surface water. And if they go forward with a remedial action plan that ignores that, then it's just it won't be efficient or effective in the future. So I think we'll get good. I think they will be inclined to include consideration of that in their remedial action plan, even though we don't have a numerical standard that we can point to right now.
Okay. You know, really, that is all I wanted to cover, and there's some reading that I want to do before getting into further depth. So unless either of you have anything to add, or Amy, if there's anyone from the public listening or wanting to ask a question, we'll take that. Otherwise, I don't know what schedules are like, but you know, a meeting a week or so before our full meeting makes sense to me to do that. And so we can look and see if we have a date in common as we get closer.
Okay.
And since we don't have any questions or comments that I can see, I think we can adjourn. So thank you all.
Great.
Good presentation on Wednesday. Thank you. Thank your team.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, they're a very good team. There's a lot of expertise in that crew that people don't necessarily recognize. It's a very strong.
I think it was appreciated by those who commented.
Good. Glad to hear that. All right.
Take care. Have a good weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone.